It's a pleasure to have a very packed room. We are aware that negotiations are happening as we speak, but it's a pleasure for us to welcome you here to the Carbon Market Watch side event on the Sustainable Development Mechanism. I will introduce you to our wonderful panel here. We still hope that the room will cool down a bit more, and with no ado, it will be a very interesting event. We'll be looking at the Sustainable Development Mechanism agreed in the Paris Agreement and how to best make it work for the climate, people, and the private sector. Our first speaker is Juliane Vogt from Carbon Market Watch. She has been working on human rights and sustainable development linked to the Clean Development Mechanism over the last years. She's been very experienced and even worked with projects on the ground and case studies. So she will give us a presentation about the social integrity of the mechanism.
Thanks, Linda, for the introduction. And just to say something in the very beginning, I hope some of you are not very disappointed to see 3 people less being here in this room and on this panel. But you know, as it was just about to happen, the subs discussions are just at the same time. So please excuse that some of our panelists won't be here. But no matter what, I hope and I think it will be a good event. So that's why I would like to dive right in and speak about how to ensure social integrity in Article 6 mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, with a special focus on the Sustainable Development Mechanism, the SDM. So many years of carbon market discussions have led up to the Paris Agreement and brought quite some strong provisions for carbon markets in Article 6. Establishing cooperative approaches, a mechanism that is more or less known as a Sustainable Development Mechanism, in short SDM, and also a bit outside from that, non-market approaches. In the chapeau of Article 6, so in Article 6.1, kind of the overall scene is set for markets, laying out some general provisions, highlighting higher ambition, sustainable development, and environmental integrity as some more or less general ground rules for markets. So and now we are actually in a very critical stage, or like the next substance will be very very important, since now we have to, or parties have to develop robust guidance. So to kind of fill this framework that we have right now with some action and with some actual substance. And looking at the SDM in particular, this elaborative work does not have to start from scratch, since in the accompanying COP decision to the Paris Agreement, it is outlined that the rules, modalities, and procedures of the mechanism shall build on the experiences and lessons learned from existing mechanisms. So, and since the Sustainable Development Mechanism is the direct successor of the Clean Development Mechanism, in short, the CDM, it will be very, very vital to look into the experiences we had with the CDM, and to learn from the good, and also to improve things that did not go that well. So Carbon Market Watch has been very closely looking into certain projects that were established under the CDM, and has been done also some work on the ground, working with local communities that were living in the vicinities of these projects, just to gain like a real perspective on what is happening on the ground of several CDM projects. And doing this work, we actually highlighted, or we found some crucial elements that need to be looked at to ensure social integrity of also this new mechanism, so to transfer these experiences that we had into the new post-2020 and the SDM world. And now I even have a slide. So some of you might wonder, why is it actually so important to look at social integrity, and why does this also needs to be focused on when setting up the rules, modalities, and procedures of the SDM? It is important to keep in mind that not only man-made climate change has severe effects on the full enjoyment of human rights, but that also that certain actions that were done to address climate change can and have had severe impacts on local communities, indigenous people, you know, forcing local communities to move from the places where they used to live, have had health impacts, and so on. And I would like to underline this by saying that this is also true for some CDM projects. So on this slide, you can see just a very few projects that we have been working on, and that I would like to present to you in very short, again highlighting that real human rights effects can also be caused by CDM projects or by climate action in general. So for one, we have here the Bajo Aguan biogas project. There was a project implemented in Honduras, which forced displacement of local communities. Then we have the Panama project in Panama called the Barro Blanco project, which brought some violation of indigenous people's rights, especially looking at the right to free, prior and informed consent before implementing actually a project. Then also the Sasa and Coal Power project, which is a project that I also personally have been to, and it was very sad actually to see what happened there on the ground with like forced displacement and also severe health implications. So I know I rushed through these projects now, and you know this could be just a side event in itself, but I just really wanted to underline like how important it is now to also look into those social integrity criteria when setting up the SDM, and with those examples just to give you an idea of why this is important, and also why human rights protection is so crucial in the implementation of climate actions in general, and the SDM now to come in particular. So now I would like to highlight actually these elements that I shortly mentioned beforehand, what we identified of why maybe some of these projects were not social and integer, and what are actually like key elements to ensure social integrity. We saw that in the CDM there were shortcomings with regards to the local stakeholder participation, then with access to remedy in cases that projects actually had negative effects on affected people, and then also with regards to the contribution of sustainable development, and also the monitoring of sustainable development benefits that were indicated when designing these projects. So I would like to walk you through these elements in a bit more detail, but before I do so, it's also important to put this new mechanism in the context of the human rights reference that we got in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement ended with a reference to human rights in its preamble, stating that all parties shall respect, promote, consider human rights in actions taken to address climate change. So this is very important, since this is like also reinforcing the existing human rights obligations that states already have, and like force it, or like calls on states to operationalize these human rights in the post-2020 regime. And this also lays actually the foundation for the SDM to be accountable to human rights. So all this, taking all this into account, and looking at it from a social and human rights perspective, we feel that great improvements must be made over the current practice that is established in the SDM. So now I would like to say a few more words about these three elements that I mentioned beforehand, and to go into it in a little bit more specifics. For one, the local stakeholder consultation. In the CDM, there was no real guidance on how this should be done, or like how this consultations need to be conducted, except actually the general requirement to have a local stakeholder consultation. And this has proven to be not sufficient enough to ensure that people that are most directly affected by these projects can participate in a sufficient way. So like the how and the who of these local stakeholder consultations was not clearly defined. And just also maybe to give you an example here so that you see actually also how relevant this is to take this into consideration is, again, this project that I mentioned earlier, the Sasan co-power project in India, where the local stakeholder consultation was mainly announced using a newspaper. So there was an ad in this newspaper saying that a local stakeholder consultation would take place at this and this time, and that date and whatnot. And since this seems to be fine, it just you have to take into account that in this area actually where people are most affected on this project, about 80% of the people are illiterate, so they never really got the information that there actually would be a local stakeholder consultation. So this is really just again to highlight that like a definition of the how and who must be invited and so on is very important, and to really to make sure that people can effectively participate in these processes. It's very important to clearly define this. And this is also why we would like to make the recommendations for the SDM that clear guidance is needed to be established for the local stakeholder consultation to ensure meaningful and effective participation, and that those processes must be done in a manner that protects the full and effective participation of those people most likely to be affected. So this is number one. Then number two, we saw that with regards to access to redress in the CDM rules, there's no redress opportunity for the civil society or for affected communities in cases where national or international rules are not complied with, or where projects actually have negative effects on those people. And this means that there's no real recourse when a project causes negative effects. And given the severe impacts that some of these projects have had, this is actually rather worrying, and something that should not be taking over like this into the SDM. And therefore, it is crucial to establish an institutional grievance process that provides actual means for recourse for project affected people and communities. And since, I don't know if you say it in English as well, but in German you say all good things are three, we have also a third element to this. And so now I would like to focus a bit on the sustainable development side. So although the CDM was established to have a dual mandate to reduce emission reductions in the most effective way, and then also on the other hand to deliver sustainable development for developing countries, in the CDM we had like missing criteria on what sustainable development actually means. It was like very fragmented, and there were very, very different outcomes in the countries that implemented CDM projects. And like a lack of this defining framework and this patchwork interpretation meant that the benefits that were actually delivered were like highly variable, and in some cases not very positive. And and what was another element to this was that the claimed benefits that were made in the project design were not really monitored. There was no mandatory monitoring of sustainable development benefits. And also, if claims were very, very much not complied with, there was no real effect for the project owners. So that didn't really mean anything. And so now when we talk about the SDM, we feel that it's important that this should be changed, and especially given the new context that we are in. So parties have made it very clear actually that sustainable development is quite a prominent feature throughout the Paris Agreement, and also in the chapeau of Article 6. And since also we have the SDGs agreed in 2015, there's no more like an understanding of what sustainable development actually is. And we feel that this should be used as a basis, and that there should be some clearly defined sustainable development criteria that can be applied throughout the activity, and that are also consistent with international obligations, also including human rights and sustainable development frameworks, obviously. So this is actually now to end my presentation, just to just to highlight the 3 key points again: local stakeholder consultation, providing means of recourse, so establishing institutional grievance processes, and also to require activities to monitor and report on the sustainable development benefits. So thank you. Oh, no, sorry, I forgot something very, very key. I knew it. Also today we are launching a policy brief, actually, where we are looking at carbon markets in the post-2020 world, looking at social and also environmental integrity. And if you are interested in this report, you can just use the little token and then download the material. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliane, for kicking this off. I think it was a very interesting presentation, especially on how to avoid the negative social impacts and link to the SDGs, which I think will be increasingly relevant in the UNFCCC context as well. I would like now to hand over to Randall Spalding-Fecher from Carbon Limits, yet another very long-standing mechanisms, and he's going to elaborate on the environmental integrity of the mechanism.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And yes, so Joanna has covered a little bit of the social issues. I'm going to cover some of the environmental integrity issues. In fact, I think since last December, there are several thousand pages of papers that have been published on this already, many by the people on this table. So I'm just going to try to hit a few important, if we still have time. So it is a new world, a brave new world for market mechanisms, right? The Paris Agreement really fundamentally changes the context for carbon markets, especially cooperation between, if we want to call it, the North and the South. Because number one, most countries actually have some form of greenhouse gas commitment now, which they didn't in the past. Number two, the specific language about no double counting. This was never mentioned before in the context of developing country participation in the Kyoto Protocol. And thirdly, there's explicit language that say the purpose of mechanisms is to lead to higher ambition, not simply to be the phrase we used to use was a zero-sum game. So, and at the same time, there's a big push, and you see it here in the conference, towards moving beyond project-based or programmatic activities to something bigger. Some people call it scaled up. Some people talk about sectoral crediting, policy crediting. How do you pull all this together and understand what it means for environmental integrity? So I'm going to use a lot of figures. I'm hoping these will account for more than 1,000 words. And I'm going to use the same figure each time in a different variation. So let me explain what I'm talking about. This is a picture of how CDM used to work. On the left side, you have, I've called it the acquiring country because buying country makes it sound like you're paying, and you're not necessarily paying something. The acquiring country, here are their business as usual emissions in the future, let's say in 2030. They do some domestic action that reduces their actual emissions, and then they purchase, in this case, they used to purchase CERs, and by combining all those, they could reach their goal under the Kyoto Protocol, right? And in the old days, the transferring country, I've called it here, it could have been the selling country, that those activities reduced their emissions, but actual and reported emissions was basically the same thing. There was no obligation to even report actually how many units you transferred from your country. So how do things look now? Well, the left side actually is very similar. So the acquiring country still does some domestic action, and then they can use, and forgive me all the carbon policy experts, I've used the word ITMOs to refer to all units under Article 6. So these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, I'm using it as a generic term. So from the acquiring country's point of view, yes, by buying those or acquiring those units, you can then meet your targets through that combination of domestic action. But the other country looks very different, because now what happens is, here are your business as usual emissions up to say 2030. You take some domestic action, but all of the benefit here that the Article 6 activity creates, which reduces your actual emissions, all has to be added back. So what the transferring country is going to report is this level of emissions, not this level. Remember, in the old days, CDM countries, their GHG inventory was this level, which means the only thing that helps you get to reach your goal is domestic action. It's not crediting. And this is really important. I'm going to come back to this a couple of times. And now I made a little note here. It probably should be in bigger text. I say domestic action here, but obviously we talk about the conditionality in terms of technology transfer and finance, et cetera. So domestic action, of course, could be supported by things like climate finance. So what this also implies is that we probably need to have some kind of linkage now between what you've pledged in your NDC and the baselines that you might be using for crediting. And why is that? Well, first of all, it's because now countries have suddenly made this very forward-looking forecast, a pledge of where they think they will be in the future based on all the policies they're committed to, what they're doing now, but also the policies that they think they will commit to over the next decade or two. So that's one reason. But perhaps the more important reason is that if you choose a more generous baseline and you transfer more credits, it just makes it harder for you to reach your goal, right? There's no longer a benefit from overselling. In fact, it just makes things harder. So there needs to be some kind of link between what's in the pledges and what we use for baselines in new crediting mechanisms. And here, what I'm trying to show now is another variation on this. So again, left side is the same. They have BAU emissions, they do domestic action, and they buy some form of credits and they meet their goal. But what happens if this country, the transfer credit, didn't take as much domestic action? Well, even though their actual emissions will be below whatever their commitment was, that's not what they'll report. Again, you have to add back. This is what the word corresponding adjustment means. If the adjustment gets to lower somebody's goal, it has to increase somebody else's goal, right? Otherwise, you're going to have double counting. So in this case, the transferring country misses their goal. They miss their NDC pledge, not because their emissions aren't actually lower, but because they've given up the rights to those emission reductions. Now, I've made this sound much simpler than it really is, right? And there are obviously some challenges. For example, I've kind of glossed over this whole question about conditionality, because for many countries, they have distinguished between where they think their emissions will be based on their own efforts versus what they want some kind of support. And there isn't any clarity on whether that support includes crediting. So we understand there needs to be some work done on that and some clarity. There are also a lot of technical issues, which, again, these are what a lot of the papers have been written on. I won't go into them today. Single versus multi-year targets, whether you're crediting inside or outside the scope of your NDCs. But there are, in many cases, technical solutions to that. Probably the more difficult one is this last one about ambition. There's not technical solutions to this. So I've assumed in these earlier pictures that your NDC pledges were ambitious. In other words, you were actually trying to go below business as usual. But there's nothing that guarantees that. And in fact, there are two ways to think about this. One is the term that we all love, which is hot air. So in the short term, what this means is if the NDC pledges were used to create some kind of crediting baseline, but they were above business as usual, right? Then what happens is the acquiring country, they don't have to do as much, right? Because they have the credits to help meet their goal. But the transferring country doesn't have to take any more effort, right? Because they're working off an let's call it an inflated baseline. I know this is very politically sensitive, so I haven't put anybody's name here. Don't quote me on this. Oh, I guess it's all being taped. But this is the reality, that there could be this issue where by using unambitious NDCs as part of your baseline formulation, you might lead to creating hot air. There's also a longer term problem. It's the perverse incentives towards not actually taking on more aggressive NDC pledges, right? Because that's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to ratchet up every few years. But if you know, as a country that wants to transfer credits, that the more ambitious your policy becomes, the less access you have to crediting revenue, obviously there's an incentive not to do that. And this is, we used to talk about this in the old days, but it's on a much larger scale because now we're talking about national targets in all countries, not just the impact that CDM might have had. So just to wrap up, we need to get some clarity on what conditionality means. Does conditionality actually relate to crediting, or is it more about things like climate finance and tech transfer? We need to start to delve into some of the technical issues sooner rather than later and define what corresponding adjustment actually means. And that ensure that whatever accounting framework is being developed here can actually track these transfer of units so that you can really ensure against the various kinds of double counting. If we're going to be revising NDCs every 5 years, then you probably have to change baselines because in a way, revising your NDC means there's almost a new business as usual. There's a new commitment being made by the country to what they can do without external support. In terms of ambition, there's some discussion about, well, could we use some hybrid of both the NDC pledge, but we have a lot of other tools available to us that have been developed in the last decade to kind of test the ambition, or test the kind of whether or not this is an appropriate baseline for particular crediting activity. And maybe a little bit more boldly, we need to think about, should there actually be an expiry date? I mean, are we going to use crediting forever for the next 50 years? Or is maybe this a transitional strategy because you don't want countries to always be holding back on the aggressiveness of their domestic policy in order to keep a chunk of crediting revenue coming in? So I'm going to stop there. There's some other questions at the bottom, but I think Jörg will begin to tackle some of those with specific examples.
Thanks a lot, Randall, for giving us an introduction to this brave new world. I'm handing over to Jörg Fissler now from Infras, which is a Swiss research and consultancy group, and he's going to speak about
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak about the Article 6 mechanism. I think 1 year important period for thinking about these mechanisms and how they might work. I'm building on work that I have done with Randall, Lambert, and also Michael and others, that where we try to figure out how could these complicated mechanisms work to keep things a bit more tangible. I did a little exercise and asked myself, I take more or less random INDC and see, okay, now how would that work in the context of that NDC? And I took the example of Tunisia, because they have also, as other countries, but they have a nice detailed INDC, and they are also not untypical in that they have a huge conditional part in the NDC. So, as Randall mentioned earlier, things have changed. I think they have changed a lot. I think an important aspect is also that the role of governments becomes much more important than it was in the CDM world. And also the role of the private sector needs to be found. I think so. There is a lot of shifting there. Of course, scaling up is very important. We've heard again this morning in the UNEP GAP report presentation that there is still a lot that needs to be done in terms of raising ambitions. The accounting of NDCs is not really clear how to track progress in reaching these NDCs, and I think it's important to see that this is a fundamental basis for any market mechanism to actually function. We have identified a number of issues with the Article 6 mechanisms. Randall mentioned just a few of them. I think at the heart of this is to avoid double counting, to clarify NDCs, INDCs, and the requirement for corresponding accounting adjustments, which basically means that as a host country, as a transferring country, if you transfer units, ITMOs, whatever from your country to another country, your emission level will increase, and this poses, of course, certain risks that you can't meet your own NDC targets. So in short, this changes the rules and the risk landscape for the transferring countries, for project developers, and also for the acquiring countries. Now, let's take the perspective of a transferring country who wants to transfer units, and there are a number of questions that come up that have to be answered at some point in time. One is what new rules should be applied, what standards to follow. Should this be a crediting standard? should we work within a ETS system and link with others? Do we work with Article 6.2, 6.4? And then coming from that, is there a need for a clarification of the NDC in a number of aspects in order to quantify the mitigation impacts? What risks are there in transferring units abroad, how to mitigate them? And also you need a kind of a plan to define in which sectors do I want mitigation activities to happen that then transfer units abroad. And finally, there needs to be the regulatory and institutional framework that makes a country able to participate in such international transfers. You need rules, market authorities, tracking systems, etc., etc. As I mentioned, I go now into the example of Tunisia, which you see on this graph here. So it shows the emission trajectories from 2010 to 2030. Tunisia has an intensity target in terms of tons CO2 per 1,000 dinar of GDP, and they pledge an unconditional contribution of -13% until 2030 related to 2010, and a conditional pledge with the help of the estimate 17 billion of US dollars in investments, where they then reach additional 28% reduction of this intensity target. The INDC covers basically all sectors, but only the gases CO2, methane, and N2O. Now, the INDC states that they intend to use market mechanisms, and explicitly they intend to use it for reaching their conditional targets. This means the market mechanisms are seen as part of the support for reaching this conditional target. This is not uncommon, but this raises, of course, conceptual issues. How to account for market mechanisms that contribute to a conditional target. You could see like two options. One is to count this towards meeting the conditional own target and towards the acquiring country targets. Of course, then we get into the situation of a kind of double claiming, or at least the potential for climate finance to act in this country is reduced. And this leads to a potential weakening of the target. This is because with climate finance, you don't transfer units from one country to another, whereas with the market mechanisms, you actually transfer them and you need these corresponding adjustments. Another option is, of course, to count it only for the acquiring country target, but then you have no contribution to your own conditional target. Potential solutions to this, and this is a tricky thing, and we might also go into this in the discussion later, is that the country itself defines a conditional target also without market mechanisms, so that it's clear what should be achieved only by climate finance, and to define clearly an area of action for market mechanisms that are not covered by the NDC pledge. If we look how baseline could be set in the case where you do mitigation actions in a sector that is covered by the NDC pledge, then the baseline should be consistent with the scenario that reaches the pledge. So we have blue, the business as usual, this would have been the baseline in the old CDM days. Then we have green, the baseline that is consistent with reaching the pledge, and everything that is below that green baseline, crediting baseline, can then be credited and can be transferred abroad. Now, let's take an example of actions in the renewable energy sector. Let's say you build some wind plant and you want to transfer these credits. Then you get only credits once your renewable generation capacity goes beyond what the NDC formulates. So the NDC defines the crediting baseline for your wind program. In the case of Tunisia, the NDC provides quite a nice disaggregation of their target into different sectors, and we see that the wind sector is expected to achieve something like 2.3 million tons of CO2 equivalent in reductions in the year 2030. So with such a quantification, one might then build a crediting baseline. Now, what are the challenges of such approaches? I think as a general observations with the new Article 6 world, of course, it's in the interest of the host country to implement the low-hanging fruits, so the low-cost measures first and use them themselves, and have more expensive measures used for international transfer. This means that the units might become more expensive than what we knew in the CDM world, which of course easy to do, but anyway, of course there's the risk that the NDC target is above business as usual, and this leads to hot air and problems with environmental integrity. And of course, there's the liability issue of what happens if the transferring country does not meet its NDC pledge. The country needs also considerable resources for the regulatory and institutional framework, accounting, etc., etc. So this is quite there's a need for capacity building there. Now let's go shortly into two other examples. So one would be that Tunisia decides to implement their cement sector into a emissions trading scheme. In that situation, they would define the cap of the ETS at the level that is consistent with the pledge in the NDC, which covers both renewables and energy efficiency. And then they could do, for instance, by a form of restricted linking using a carbon asset reserve, for instance, a kind of linking that allows the country to control the flow of the units, and that has also certain risk mitigation aspects in it. With such a linking, they could then sell their overachievements of the NDC target abroad. And the third example is probably the simplest case. If one does a program that is outside of the NDC scope, for instance, introduction of low GWP refrigerant, which reduce the F-gas emissions that are not covered by the NDC. In this case, you could just use the CDM style business as usual baselines. To wrap up, a few findings from the point of view of a transferring country. In order to participate in market mechanisms, it may be beneficial to clarify its NDC and to have a robust accounting for market mechanisms with all these different aspects. This needs these resources. So I think with Article 6 we have a clear shift from the need of resources towards governments, and the crediting baselines, if the activities are within the NDC, have to depend on this NDC. If not, there is a risk of non-achieving the NDC for the country, and of course the risk of hot air that has been mentioned before. From a general point of view, I think robust international accounting framework is essential for the environmental integrity of any Article 6 mechanisms. Market mechanisms may set perverse incentives in the sense of a race to the bottom for transferring countries, and there is also a role for acquiring countries who buy or purchase units that they insist on certain standards for accounting and so on. And last but not least, I want to repeat the message from Randall and others that market mechanisms, given all these factors, should be more a transitory mechanism that will fade out at some point in time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jörg, also for already giving me a way to introduce our next speaker. As you mentioned, that the role of the private sector needs to be found still, and that's what Professor on climate change for many years already, and he's vice president of GERERE, which he will introduce to us shortly, and he will give a presentation on how to engage the private.
Try to have the slide first. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to ask you to make an effort because I have a voice problem. Well, I will then share with you a view on the experiences of CDM for developing countries, in particular in Africa and the MENA region. And we will try together to see how we can capitalize from these experiences to build a new SDM which could be profitable for all. Yeah, pardon. Before, I would like to present GERERE, which is an NGO which has been created in 1992. Of course, we worked on renewable energy and energy efficiency, but since 1996, GERERE has been very active on climate change. It's co-founded the Climate Action Network Maghreb, which is represented in Cannes International, as you know. Okay, let's begin. Let's have a view on 2 or 3 slides, which just give us an idea on CDM experiences for Africa and the MENA region. You have this slide, all of you know it, of course it's clear, which shows clearly that Africa is not in as a country which could have a benefit from CDM. The second one shows that from CDM portfolio internationally now, most of the projects are especially for industry gas and renewable energy at the large scale, which doesn't exist a lot in Africa. And the third slide concerns this different step. I mean, to have a project registered and to have the CR issued. Let's see now what's happened until 2012. You can see from the report, which is shown there, that 70% only of the CR expected has been issued. That means that we lost 30%. Of course, we can consider that in the way how to write the PDD, we had surestimation of the, but it's 30%. But let's go later, 2013, it becomes 50%. That shows clearly that CDM had a lot of handicap, which we have to identify and to integrate in the way how we will build this new mechanism. Before, let's focus on Morocco experiences. Well, Morocco is one of the countries in Africa who has a significant portfolio. We have 16 registered projects, but from the 16 registered projects, we have 8 projects with expected CR on 2012. Result, until 2012 only, we expected to have accumulated 2,754 kilotons CO2, but we have only 25% of this. Second element, we had 8 projects who necessarily, normally should have issued CR. From these 8, we have only 2. Big problem. That means that there is a problem. What is the problem? The problem is clear, and we know it in developing countries like in MENA region and Africa. The first one, as you know, is the complexity of CDM process. It's completely complex, we know it, and I'm sure the SDM will be complex like the CDM if it's not more complex. Then we have to find a solution for these countries. The second one is a lack of expertise to success in this process. The third one is a lack of data. You have a process to lead the project completely known with the limit, etc. But it needs data. In our countries, we haven't enough data for that. Fourth problem is the transaction cost. You know that I have example of project proponent in Morocco who spend 300,000 euro to register the project, and all at the end they have €0. The fifth problem is the need for the proponent to advance the necessary fund without guarantee to access to CR. That's something which could be acceptable in South Africa, in China, in India, but not in Mali, not in Africa in general. Fifth point is that this market, this link between the mechanism CDM and the market, which was completely open. You know what's happened. You know how the market price has fallen from €30 to now around €1 or less. And that is something which is not acceptable at all. And we cannot imagine private sector in these countries follow the international community in a new mechanism if they give the same type of things. I don't know if I have enough time. No, I can take my time. Okay, well, another problem is the lack of lawyers who knows exactly how to develop the contract. You know, in Morocco, for example, they had contract with Carbon Corporation, and when when the market plunged after 2009, most of these corporations found a way to not to meet this commitment. They had in a specific article of the contract something like force majeure, majeure force, but in Morocco, the project component couldn't understand this, and then it was late. These are the handicap. What could we propose for the new mechanism? Maybe 5 points. To simplify the mechanism with simple safeguards. We don't say simplify completely. We know that we need transparency. We need not to have double counting, etc., etc. But we must, for Africa, have a simplified mechanism with an articulation which let this safeguard existing. Second point, this additionality, as you know well, It's a big thing for Africa project, and I don't think it's logic to let the additionality as it is in the next mechanism for renewable energy and energy efficiency. It's something which should be removed. The third point is the technical and financial support for project proponent to go through the process as it is, including setting contract with carbon credit buyer. These project proponents should be supported absolutely, not only by session of capacity building. It's not the only demand, because session of capacity building on contract in Africa, it's every week, with no real result. That means that we have to imagine a new mechanism which support African to elaborate this project and to follow them. Capacity building, of course, for African expert, and also in this, not only to develop the project, in particular to monitor the project, because I spoke to you about these 8 projects in Morocco and only 2 who could have the CR. Why? In particular, because they were not able to have a clear and sustainable monitoring process. That means that we need expertise to elaborate project, to be registered, but to accompany it, to get the monitoring process successful. I will end with something which my colleague doesn't like, I'm sure, is this question of price. I believe that for African country, even if it's not the case for other countries, and for the SDM, the new mechanism, future for Paris Accord, we need to have a floor price for CR coming for this mechanism. If we don't do that, take this decision, for example, in Morocco, private sector proponent will never go through another mechanism with another risk like the one we had before. Thank you very much. Sorry for...
Thanks a lot, Ali. I hope everybody understood him well, but see. Last but not least, I will hand over to Lambert Schneider, a member of the CDM board, and he has been following the CDM and JE for many years as well, and he will give us his assessment, and maybe he wants to react to some of the concerns that have been raised already.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm more a panelist, not a presenter here, so I will try to react to some of the areas. So I will start with the social aspect, which Juliana highlighted, and I think this is a learning process, and it's interesting to see the developments over time. So first, the first point is I even have a question more, and that is we have this principle of sustainable development, but many of the concerns with projects have to do with environmental and social safeguards. And so I'm wondering sometimes whether if project developers report on co-benefits, they report on the co-benefits, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are environmental and social safeguards in place. And what I observe is that in international finance institutions, environmental and social safeguards are common, but in carbon markets, they are not. And maybe that is a tool one would need to think about to address some of the issues, and not only the sustainable development context and the sustainable development benefits. I think also we learned a lot on stakeholder consultation, what's going wrong, what has worked. And what is interesting to me is that this learning process led to some improvements over time. So for example, 1 year ago in Paris, the CDM Executive Board adopted revised rules for stakeholder consultation. And they are not yet effective. They are being implemented, but they, for example, allow for the first time a stakeholder consultation. They require stakeholder consultation for the first monitoring report, because one of the key deficits which we faced is that stakeholder comments were provided at the start of the project, but then the project was implemented and there were problems with how the project is being implemented, and there was no formal opportunity for stakeholders to report on this implementation. I think, as Juliana highlighted also, a lot of problems have had to do with how stakeholder comments are being invited in the local context. And so now we will also have more specific rules for how stakeholder comments have to be invited, through which media, etc. So there are some improvements being implemented. I think also what's interesting is that the CDM modalities and procedures, they do not have environmental and social safeguards, as I said, but they're the CDM modalities and procedures for CCS, for carbon storage and sequestration projects. And there's no such project out. But if you look to the CDM requirements, they are quite stringent. They say you should have, the country can only participate in a CCS project if it has national laws in place which allow individuals to seek redress if they are damaged. That's not something every country has in place. And so that's a quite interesting rule. I mean, it never came to application because we never had a CDM project, but it could be a rule which could be looked at possibly for some risky projects in the context of Article 6. This is just a personal thought. We also faced in the board a number of human rights, accusations of human rights violations, as was explained, and the board felt unable to assess these and felt that that was a prerogative of the countries, and there was no consensus on this matter in the board. But one thing which we did is we informed the host countries about that, and recently for the first time, and we allowed a procedure to withdraw a letter of approval, which was controversial, but which is possible for host countries to do. And as maybe some of you are aware, the last week this happened for the first time. So one of these critical projects, which were also brought to our attention by Carbon Market Watch, has been withdrawn by the host country, by Panama, through a letter of withdrawal. And so this means effectively that this project in the future will not be able to issue CRs anymore. So these are some interesting developments and lessons learned, I think. I think on the integrity, I think not only the CDM, but also JI really provides important lessons learned on the environmental integrity, because we will be under Article 6 a lot in a JI setting. And I think a lot, what was also said by other speakers, boils down to the ambition of targets. So if countries have ambitious NDCs and they really have to reduce emissions, they will have incentives to ensure environmental integrity of units which they sell, because otherwise, as was pointed out, they run into trouble. The problem which we face is that the NDCs, that the ambition of the NDCs is rather mixed. There are some countries which have ambitious NDCs, but there are also some countries which likely have hot air. And so the question is what to do in that case. And I think you could do you could approach this from two different layers. You could either try to provide oversight on the mechanisms, to look at additionality, third-party verification, and all these elements, how mechanisms work, or you could put rules in place which limit somehow the participation of these countries in international carbon markets, which is politically, of course, controversial. But I think that's a key issue which we will have to address under Article 6, a key problem that we could, again, as under JI, run an international transfer of hot air. I think, as was pointed out, we had a lot of problems with regional distribution under the CDM. As was pointed out, many credits went to particular countries. I'm a bit more optimistic that this may change, because I think there are lots of efforts underway to help countries to participate in the carbon market. And more importantly, I think we will not have the situation again where we have one price and all the countries compete. But I expect that we will have different windows or different buyers and different sellers which buy certain projects. So there could be buyers which particularly focus on countries which are underrepresented, on least developed countries, and help them move forward with projects, and that are willing to pay higher prices and to provide the necessary capacity building. So maybe in the future we will not have this one single market, but we will address this level playing field through possibly through different buyers purchasing different types of units. I think a lot of work has also been done on reducing transaction costs. The board has been working on simplification a lot in the last years. This may not have been noticed so much because the market has gone down, but a lot of simplification, for example, for programs of activities has been done on standardized baselines, on positive lists for small scale methodologies. I would have, just as a reaction, I would have a concern to grant automatic additionality to large groups of projects, because I think that could also pose risks in some instances if these projects would not be additional. Yeah, and what I already said with regard, I think the price issue, that's a very relevant one. I mean, it's probably not possible to implement a floor price, but maybe there will be different prices. And like we have these World Bank pilot programs, like the pilot auction facility, we have the CDEF, which pay higher prices for particular project types or for particular regions. So maybe possibly that is a way to mitigate this shortcoming. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would now like to open the floor for questions or reactions. Please, if just raise your hand to Mark and then quickly introduce yourself before you speak. There will be a microphone. There will be a microphone coming around. So I'll take a couple. So the two here, please. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Wolfgang Obergassel from the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. I have 3 quick questions, if I may. The first one is on the sustainable development issues. As you explained in the CDM, there's no international governance of sustainable development and stakeholder consultations, but only national governance. Do you have examples of countries where you would say they are doing a good job in terms of how stakeholder consultations and SD are being done in those countries? Second question, about accounting for NDCs in baselines and additionality. What exactly do we mean by NDCs in that context? Is it really the NDC, the document and what's written in there, and that's what needs to be accounted for? Or is it all the national policies? Because there's a lot of NDCs which only talk about CO2, but the countries do have policies for renewables, etc., etc., etc. So would those need to be accounted for in baselines additionality or not? And the third one, to Lambert specifically, your idea about limiting participation to countries with ambitious targets. Do you have some more specific ideas for how that could work in practice? Basically, telling countries that their NDCs are not good enough to participate. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There was a question, yeah, I think also a bit further in the first round. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Michael Young from Australia. I'm intrigued in the language and the way all this is put together. I've worked in fisheries and water markets. And in both those sectors, there's a big gap between the markets that work and the ones that are awkward and always get into strife. The first thing you see in the markets that work is there are actually 2 markets, not one. There's a market in the shares, and the shares are always issued in perpetuity. And they're a share of the quota and a share of the amounts that are going to be allocated as they vary through time. And then there's a market in the permits or the allocations. What the market in shares do is they promote long-term investment, and the real incentives for innovation come from a capacity for people to contract into the future. And that drives the incentive. When I look at all of the discussion around CDMs at the moment, I see all these design flaws, and I'm puzzled why the people involved in this are not looking to the global experience in this. When you set a quota and when you try and manage things through time and drive innovation, the clues are obvious. You have 2 markets, not one, and you have rigorous accounting rules. And the fact that you might even design a system that has hot air in it means you're going to end up in legal fights that destroy all of the incentives you're trying to achieve. So what I'm really asking is, why isn't there already a discussion about setting up some sort of mechanism in which contracts and guarantees that the permits, or whatever they're called, will be supplied in the future? And the way to do that is to have shares of what the allocations are going to be through time. You never do it as quantities, you always do it as shares. Every country that tried to do it as a fixed quantity around the world ended up in courts and having to tear up their system and start again. This is very elementary, but I would like to ask members of the panel why it's not being discussed in the current framework.
Thanks a lot. I'll take another two if there are. There's a lady in the back, please.
Hello, my name is Mareike Blum. I'm from the University of Freiburg in Germany. And I have two short questions. First, how do you see the role of third-party verification, or let's say private standards like the verified carbon standard or the gold standard? Also, yeah, when it comes to these problems with consultation or social integrity. And second, why is there no floor price possible? What is the explanation for this? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would take one more if there is, else I would. Okay, if you would just pass it on one. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm Lisa Hamilton. I'm from the Center for International Environmental Law. I just had a quick question about whether this discussion with respect to enforcement in Article 6 is being connected in any way to the Article 15 discussions on compliance. Having been to one of those sessions, there's very strong language that suggests that the purpose of the Paris Agreement is simply that it's facilitative, it is non-punitive, there won't be penalties, there won't be sanctions. And it seems that in terms of earlier discussions about redress, that there's a lack of an opportunity to really address some of the human rights and other potential violations. And I was just wondering whether in that discussion, had you looked at the Article 15 discussions as well?
Thanks a lot. I'll revert back to the panel and go in reverse order. So Lambert, if you want to go first.
Okay, I think there was a specific question on the limitation or eligibility to participate in carbon markets. I think this is a tricky issue, but I think some proposals have been put forward by parties. So I think Brazil put forward a proposal to put limits on transfers of ITMOs, similar to the Doha Amendment, where you look at your reported emissions and or possibly your emission trends, and you see whether that's linked to. And I think what's important also from the reaction of the discussants, I think the objective is not to prevent countries which have targets which are below business as usual, but maybe not very ambitious, not to prevent them from participating, LDCs from participation. But I think the idea is to prevent countries which clearly set their target far above any reasonable level where they would likely achieve, and to prevent those countries from trading. So that are the ideas. And I just want to note that it's not a few countries. Like if you compare the IPCC scenarios, the IPCC with policy scenarios, so with existing policies in place, and you compare them with the ambition of the NDC, you will find for many countries that with the policies they have already adopted, the emissions will be far lower than the target which they set. And so I think one other rationale for thinking about is that to avoid this issue of disincentives for future targets, how you set them, because there's a risk that carbon markets could set incentives to set future NDCs at very loose levels in order to export more carbon credits. And that would be very unfortunate if carbon markets would undermine ambition in that way by setting bad incentives not to go for ambition. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Ali, would you want to react to any of the questions specifically?
maybe I have just a remark about the fact that, for example, in the national contribution until now, when we see African contribution, you have unconditional and conditional, and then the market. I'm not sure that baseline as it is, as we see it now, could be the conditional. And I'm not sure that it won't be necessary to use the market as a mechanism which is complementary to the direct financing. That's something which is not clear. I mean, in our countries, we don't know exactly. Of course, we see all these curves in which you have the baseline, unconditional, conditional, and then the market. But in reality, we are not sure it will be successful if they use a mechanism. If we use a mechanism like CDM, we must go to something which is larger, in which we can support more policy, more group of activities, and not only project by project. I know we tried a lot of mechanisms which go in this way, but we have to build something which is a little bit mixing between all what we had before. Thank you.
Jörg, please.
Thank you. I can try to tackle two questions. One is about do we need to look only at the NDCs, or should we look into NDCs and national policies when it comes to setting a baseline for market mechanisms? And I think it's the latter. This was Wolfgang's question. I think it's necessary to look at the whole policy package within the transferring country, which may or may not be stated explicitly in the INDC. I think that's necessary. Then I would like to try to answer two questions which are related to markets. One was, is a floor price possible? And the other was, shouldn't we look into different markets rather than looking at the markets of the units? And I think it's important to see that what the Paris Agreement provides. I mean, the word market as such is not in there, so it is not a market per se, but it provides the opportunities for markets to operate, and therefore it also cannot set a floor price, but it players can come in, such as countries, such as development banks, private sector, who can build these markets and operate within this regulatory framework. And I think what we've seen with the CDM, that once there is a certain scarcity and a certain demand for something, be it units or whatever, then a market flourishes. And there we had also all sorts of secondary units. We had the derivatives and other financial instruments. So I think things come and once there is a scarcity, and the problem right now is that there is no scarcity, that these markets don't take off.
Thanks a lot, Jörg. I give the floor to Randall and then Juliana, and I think the questions on the third-party verification and the compliance haven't been answered so far.
Okay, so I can maybe say a couple of words about third-party verification. Certainly most of the people working on what might happen in the new mechanisms consider this very, very important. I like the way you said specifically what might things like the VCS and gold standard do, and I can see two different things happening there. One is that the work that's being done there could be the basis for some of the negotiations on what should 6.4 look like, you know, because there something like sustainable development issues have been developed has been developed much more in the gold standard, so you could bring that into it. But the other way to think about this is that this idea of clubs of countries with recognizing particular types of standards under 6.2. You know, some people say, oh, well, 6.2 is going to be really vague and you're going to have all this hot air and it might not be strict at all, but that's not necessarily true. You can have groups of countries that actually go for the highest possible standards, the highest possible activities in terms of stakeholder consultation, etc. That's possible as well. Well, I wanted to also say something quickly on Wolfgang's point. See, I think part of the answer to your question depends on how you define the NDC. If the NDC is a greenhouse gas mitigation target, then whether you have the right full list of policies that got you there is irrelevant. The point is that's the greenhouse gas pledge. Now, not all countries have that, but as we move towards that, I think that is what Jörg means by everything is wrapped in there, because ultimately it's where are your emissions going? And then I'm not an expert on fisheries, but I do remember reading a bit about this. And I think part of the answer to your question is that to make a system like that work, you need a top-down authority that can decide on what the shares are, right? So, and if we had that, if we had a global top-down binding cap, then you're absolutely right. We could create wonderful allowance markets within that. That's not the world we have. So we're having to use a baseline and crediting system. The big advantage is we can do that, even in an international system, but then you get to some of the problems that we've highlighted about defining those baselines. So I think it's just a difference in the kind of international versus national policy environment.
Thanks, Juliana.
Okay, so with regards to best practice guidance, it's a little bit tricky to point out best practices because you don't always have access to the actual national rules that are at place for local stakeholder consultation, and also not for what is the criteria for the sustainable development. But certainly I know that also like a gold standard, they did some guidelines on how to do local stakeholder consultations, and that's definitely something very helpful. And Carbon Market Watch right now is also working on defining some best practice guidelines on local stakeholder consultations, where we also work together with people from the ground to get their experience, and then also using the gold standard guidelines that are already out there.
Okay, we have another 10 minutes, so I would like to collect another set of questions, if there are any.
Everything is clear.
I'm very proud of my panel if there are no more questions. Yes, wait, if you would wait for the microphone, I think that would facilitate the others. Sorry.
My name is Senior from Imaflara, Brazil, and I have a very simple question, maybe basic. It's like how to regulate this baseline set up in order to avoid its inflation. Because when we talk like a country INDC and a country target and all this, it comes to a huge perhaps gaps on this carbon market. So my question is again, how to regulate this INDC baseline setup?
Thanks a lot. Is there any other question? Yes, Wolfgang again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a comment rather on the issue you had on conditionality, how to deal with that. Do we then have either double claiming or no contribution to the host country NDC? Wouldn't it be possible to split up the reduction between the transferring and the acquiring country? In this way, you would have no double claiming. The host country would have a contribution towards its NDC, but the acquiring country would also have a contribution towards its NDC.
Thanks a lot. Who of the panel would like to react to these two questions? Jörg, please.
Thank you. The conditionality question. So this is the situation where you do crediting in an area that is part of your conditional pledge, meaning that the country says, yes, we do that, but only if we get international carbon finance technology transfer and market mechanisms. And I think if you split it up, it doesn't solve it, because then you still have the transfer of units from one country to another that are part of the conditional pledge, which reduces the potential for climate finance. And also you then have a kind of double counting, because this half is pledged the how do you say? So you still I think doesn't fully solve it, but because you still transfer units from under the conditional pledge, even though some of the money is used to fulfill that as a part of a climate finance. Maybe others have more clarifying views on this. I think it's a
Okay, just quickly, I'm going to come back to that. But first, one of the last points I made is that one idea is that, first of all, once you try to take some national NDC target and bring it down to a sectoral level, which is a challenge in and of itself, the idea is that maybe what you do is you use other tools. So we have a whole lot of CDM tools. We have tools from VCS, Gold Standard. We have a lot of other tools. Even now, there are ones being developed for scaled up crediting. So it may be that you kind of do a double check, right? So that rather than saying, we're going to have some external standard to evaluate everybody's NDC ambition, you might do it just in the area where you're looking to credit. The way I might put this is in a practical example. If you're 100 units away from reaching a conditional target, right? And there's a project in your country that has 100 units of emission reduction, and you say, great, we're going to divide that. I'll sell 50 and I'll keep 50. You don't meet your conditional target, right? Yes, you're getting there, but you're still going to miss your conditional target because the 50 units leave you. They're added back onto your inventory. So yes, this idea of sharing makes sense. It makes a lot of sense in terms of mitigating the risk, because the problem is we don't know right now how close you will be to your target 10 years from now. But anything that is transferred gets added back. That's the most important thing to remember, I think.
Yeah, just I understood your question regarding the baseline, more the country baseline or the BAU. Was that your question? Yeah, yeah. I think there's no way internationally to influence that, because in the end NDCs are self-determined, and that's a key principle of the Paris Agreement. And so it's difficult how to intervene internationally, how countries define their NDC, and therefore. But I think it's also politically controversial, but it may be easier to set restrictions on the participation in international transfers and to provide oversight, and maybe have reporting, which could be reviewed under Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, reporting provisions. But I think the NDC itself is so nationally self-determined that it's difficult to get international guidance for that. That's my personal assessment. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Jörg, please.
Just on this issue, I think, as I also mentioned earlier, the acquiring countries, the countries buying units, they also play an important role in shaping this market, in particular over the next few years, in that they set certain standards that countries buy only from other countries where they think, yes, this is a robust pledge, robust NDC, and we are not just buying hot air, because in many countries that's in their own interest, because they are using taxpayer monies or some other funds from the population, and there will be bad press, very bad press, if it's demonstrated that the money they pay out actually doesn't lead to actual emission reductions in the host country. But other than that, I'm a bit skeptical that international oversight and governance can achieve that, given the history we had with the CDM. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any further reactions? So that may a final question. Okay. There's a microphone coming. If you want to. Thanks.
Good evening, all of you. I thought that if there is a bank for carbon market, is there in the world? national bank. How how we can market carbon? How we can market carbon if or sell it or sell carbon if we have no any bank for all the countries in the world to finance the carbon for all the countries.
I mean, basically, what this is talking about is the rules for a market. And once you have a market, then you can have banks and companies and countries, and they then they buy carbon or they sell carbon. But first we have the rules of the play, and once they are established, then banks come in and can work within that market. But there's no such thing as the carbon bank of the world.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. With this, I would like to close. I would like to thank my wonderful panel and also you as an audience for being interested in this event. A final round of applause. And for any further reading, I can only recommend the paper that Juliana mentioned in the beginning.
On the website.
I was just referring, yes. It's online, and it's also, you can use those tokens outside the door, and then to download all the material that's connected to this side event. And there's like this policy brief on carbon markets post 2020.